The phone rang sharply, cutting through the quiet evening in their Seattle apartment. Calvin stared at the unknown number, his heart sinking as he answered, only to hear the voice he hadn't heard in 10 years. "Son, it's your father. I heard about the wedding." Theodore walked in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his light brown hair catching the warm glow of the pendant light, and froze when he saw the color drain from Calvin's face. 10 years earlier, Calvin had been 22, fresh out of college and head over heels for his first real boyfriend, standing in the family living room in suburban Chicago while his father, Edward Hayes, slammed a fist on the table and declared that no son of his would ever walk down an aisle with another man. The words had shattered everything, forcing Calvin to choose between love and family, and the heartbreak had sent him fleeing across the country to Seattle, where he rebuilt himself piece by piece as an architect who designed homes for people who actually believed in forever. Now, at 32, he had Theodore, the steady, kind-hearted lawyer who had become his everything, and their wedding was only 3 months away. The invitation list was printed, the venue booked on the waterfront, and Calvin had finally allowed himself to believe that the past was buried. But Edward's voice on the line sounded different now, almost gentle, offering to pay for the entire ceremony and even fly out to meet them. "I've changed, Calvin. Let me make it right." Theodore placed a supportive hand on Calvin's shoulder, his touch grounding, but Calvin could feel the old wound reopening like a fresh cut. He muttered something about needing time and hung up, then sank onto the couch, staring at the framed photo of him and Theodore on their first trip to the Olympic Peninsula, both laughing under towering evergreens. "He banned me from even talking about marriage back then," Calvin whispered, voice thick with the memory of nights spent crying alone in a cheap studio apartment. "Now he wants to play the generous dad?" Theodore sat beside him, dark eyes steady and full of the quiet strength that had carried them through Calvin's late-night doubts about whether he deserved this happiness. "You don't owe him anything, Cal. But if you want to hear him out, I'm right here." They stayed up late that night, talking in low voices while rain pattered against the windows, Calvin tracing the lines of Theodore's hand as he recounted the years of silence, the holidays spent alone, the therapy sessions where he learned to stop apologizing for who he loved. By morning, Calvin had decided to meet his father for coffee, not out of forgiveness yet, but out of a need to close the door properly before walking through the one that led to his future with Theodore. The next day, Edward arrived at the cafe near Pike Place Market looking older, his once sharp suit now slightly loose on a frame thinned by stress, but his eyes still held that commanding glint. He hugged Calvin awkwardly, then launched into stories about the family business, a mid-sized logistics company struggling in the post-pandemic economy. "Your mother told me about the wedding photos online. Beautiful. I want to be part of it, son. Let me cover everything, no strings." Calvin listened, chest tight, while Theodore waited outside, giving them space but staying close enough to catch Calvin's eye through the window if needed. As the conversation stretched, Calvin felt the familiar pull of old loyalty warring with the life he had built without his father, the one where he and Theodore cooked Sunday brunches and volunteered at the local LGBTQ youth center. By the time they parted, Calvin had agreed to let Edward attend a small planning dinner, telling himself it was just politeness. But as he walked back to Theodore under the gray Seattle sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken lingered in his father's smile. Theodore pulled him into a hug right there on the sidewalk, murmuring, "Whatever happens, it's our story, not his." Calvin nodded, but deep down the old fear stirred, the one that whispered he might still be the boy who was told his love was wrong. That night, they lay in bed talking until dawn, Calvin's head on Theodore's chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had become his anchor. The wedding planning continued the following week, venue tastings and florist meetings filled with laughter and small decisions that felt monumental. Yet every time Calvin checked his phone, Edward's texts arrived like gentle reminders that the past was circling back. Friends noticed the shift too. Marcus, their mutual best friend and fellow architect, teased Calvin over drinks about the prodigal dad plot twist. but his eyes held concern as they discussed how society still judged gay couples who dared to claim the same milestones as everyone else. "You've come so far, man. Don't let him dim that light." Theodore agreed quietly later, reminding Calvin of the day they first said, "I love you," on a ferry crossing Puget Sound, wind whipping their hair as they promised each other a future free of shame. Calvin held onto that memory like a lifeline, but the meeting with Edward had cracked open questions he thought were settled. Could a father who once rejected him truly change, or was this just another way to control the son who had dared to live openly? The week blurred into finalizing guest lists and choosing vows, each step forward laced with the quiet dread that Edward's return might unravel the beautiful life they had woven together. Calvin found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror one evening, tracing the faint lines around his eyes earned from years of fighting for this happiness, wondering if the man staring back was strong enough to face whatever came next. Theodore wrapped his arms around him from behind, kissing his neck softly, and in that moment Calvin felt the warmth of their shared future pushing back against the shadows. Yet as they prepared for the family dinner, the air in their apartment grew heavier with anticipation, the kind that signaled a turning point neither of them could yet name. The family dinner unfolded at a quiet Italian restaurant downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and soft jazz playing in the background, chosen by Theodore to keep things neutral. Edward arrived early, shaking Theodore's hand with a firmness that felt calculated, complimenting the venue choice and even asking about Calvin's latest architectural project with what seemed like genuine interest. "You've done well for yourself, son. Better than I expected after." Well, the words hung there, heavy with the weight of the past ban that had forced Calvin to build everything on his own terms. Theodore squeezed Calvin's knee under the table, his presence a silent promise that they were in this together. Two men who had chosen each other despite every obstacle society and family had thrown their way. Conversation flowed at first around safe topics, the weather, Seattle traffic, but Edward soon steered it toward the wedding, offering to host a rehearsal dinner at his hotel, and even suggesting high-profile guests from his business circle. "It could be good for all of us. Show the world we've moved on as a family." Calvin felt his stomach twist, memories flooding back of the day Edward had torn up the college acceptance letter to a school in California because it was too liberal and might encourage the lifestyle he disapproved of. Theodore noticed the tension and smoothly changed the subject to their honeymoon plans in Hawaii, describing the private beach bungalow they had booked, but Edward's eyes lingered on Calvin with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. Later that night, back in their apartment, Calvin paced the living room while Theodore brewed chamomile tea, the scent filling the space like a calming embrace. "He keeps saying he's changed, but something feels off," Calvin admitted, voice cracking with the vulnerability he only showed Theodore. 10 years ago he told me I'd never have a real family, that loving you or any man would ruin my life. Now he's acting like the proud dad." Theodore listened without interrupting, then pulled Calvin onto the couch, their fingers intertwining as they talked through the night. He reminded Calvin of their first date, a rainy afternoon at the Chihuly Garden and Glass where they had shared stories of coming out. Theodore describing his own conservative upbringing in a small Oregon town and how he had walked away from his parents' expectations to live authentically. "We built this life together, Cal. No one gets to hijack it." The following days brought more wedding preparations, meetings with the photographer and cake tastings that should have been joyful but now carried an undercurrent of doubt. Calvin's sister Emily called from Chicago, excited about the trip but warning that their father had been acting strangely, mentioning the company was in talks with new investors who valued family unity. The word stuck with Calvin like a thorn. At work the next morning, sketching designs for a community center that celebrated diversity, he found himself pausing to text Theodore a simple, "I love you," needing the reassurance that their bond was stronger than any family manipulation. Marcus joined them for lunch, sharing stories of his own past heartbreaks in the gay community, how societal pressure had once made him hide his relationships until he learned to stand tall. "Your dad's return is a test, man. Don't let it define you." Edward's texts increased, each one laced with offers to pay for upgrades, a bigger band, even suggesting a feature in a local magazine about modern family reconciliation. Calvin showed Theodore one evening over dinner, the two of them sitting on their balcony overlooking the city lights, wine glasses half full. "It feels like he's using our day as a stage," Calvin said quietly, the city humming below them like a reminder that life moved forward regardless of old wounds. Theodore set his glass down and took Calvin's face in his hands, their foreheads touching in the way that always centered them. "Then we decide the rules. This wedding is about us, our love, the future we choose." They made love that night with a tenderness born of shared history, not passion alone. Calvin whispering promises into Theodore's skin about never letting anyone come between them again. Yet the cracks widened when Edward insisted on joining a venue walkthrough the next weekend. Standing under the string lights of the waterfront pavilion, Calvin watched his father chat with the coordinator, dropping names and hinting at corporate sponsorships for the event. Theodore pulled Calvin aside near the water's edge, the sound lapping gently as seagulls cried overhead. "He's pushing too hard. Remember why we started this, Cal? The day you proposed on that hike and said you wanted a life without secrets." Calvin nodded, but the internal storm raged. Part of him longed for the approval he had craved as a boy. The other part, hardened by years of independence, recognized the pattern of control. That evening, alone in the shower, Calvin let the water wash away tears he hadn't shed in years, questioning if his growth had been real or just a fragile shell. Theodore waited with open arms afterward, and they talked until the stars faded, Calvin realizing that true strength wasn't denying the past but facing it without letting it steal their joy. The wedding invitations went out the following Monday, and for a brief moment, hope flickered brighter than the doubt, until Edward's next call arrived with news that he wanted to meet the rest of their friends. "To understand your world better," Calvin agreed, but the unease settled deeper, like fog rolling in from the bay, signaling that the real test was only beginning. The gathering with friends turned into an evening of laughter and stories around a long table at their favorite tapas bar, Marcus regaling everyone with tales of past pride parades while Emily, who had flown in early, shared childhood memories that carefully avoided their father's darker chapters. Edward sat at the head like he belonged, nodding along and even raising a toast to second chances and love that endures. Calvin watched him closely, noting how Edward steered conversations toward business opportunities, mentioning how a public wedding could highlight inclusive leadership for potential partners. Theodore remained gracious, refilling glasses and steering talk back to personal anecdotes, but Calvin caught the subtle tension in his partner's jaw, the protective glint that said he would fight for their peace. As the night wore on, Edward pulled Calvin aside near the bar, his voice low. "Son, this wedding could be the fresh start we both need. My company's facing some challenges, investors love a good redemption story, and seeing you happy publicly. It shows I've evolved." The admission hit like a wave, not the outright exploitation yet, but enough to make Calvin's chest tighten with the realization that his happiness was being measured in dollar signs. He excused himself to the restroom, splashing water on his face and staring at his reflection, remembering the teenage version of himself who had hidden magazines under his bed and prayed his father would never find out. Theodore found him there, wrapping arms around him in the dim hallway, whispering, "You are enough. We are enough. He doesn't get to rewrite our story." They left early, walking home hand in hand through the cool night air, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement like scattered diamonds. The weeks that followed blurred into a whirlwind of fittings and decisions. At the tailor, Calvin stood on the platform in his charcoal suit, while Theodore adjusted his tie, their eyes meeting in the mirror with a quiet promise that this day would be theirs alone. Edward offered to fly in a celebrity florist, but Calvin politely declined, choosing instead local blooms that symbolized their journey from secrecy to openness. Yet doubt crept in during quiet moments at work, sketching blueprints while replaying Edward's words, wondering if refusing his help made him the ungrateful son society sometimes painted gay men to be. Marcus noticed during a gym session, spotting Calvin on the bench press and later sharing over protein shakes, how his own family had once tried to buy acceptance with money after his coming out. It's not love if there's a price tag, Cal. Theodore organized a small bachelor-style weekend with close friends, a cabin in the Cascades where they hiked and talked around the fire about the pressures gay couples faced, from workplace discrimination to family expectations. Calvin opened up about the band that had cost him his first love and nearly his sanity, and Theodore held his hand through it all, reminding everyone that their relationship had survived because it was built on truth, not appearances. Back in Seattle, Edward pushed harder with daily calls, suggesting joint interviews or sponsorships that would benefit the community. Calvin finally confronted him over the phone one afternoon, voice steady for the first time. "This is our day, Dad. Not a PR opportunity." Edward laughed it off, but the silence that followed felt loaded. That evening, over homemade pasta, Theodore and Calvin discussed boundaries, drawing up a list of non-negotiables that included no media at the ceremony and no financial strings. The conversation turned deep, Theodore sharing his fears of losing Calvin to old family ties, Calvin confessing the guilt that still whispered he owed his father redemption. They ended the night on the roof deck, wrapped in a blanket under the stars, Theodore's head on Calvin's shoulder as they imagined their future children, adopted or fostered, growing up in a home free of the shame Edward had imposed. The wedding was now 6 weeks away, RSVPs pouring in from friends who had become their chosen family, yet Edward's presence loomed like a storm cloud. When he showed up unannounced at their apartment the next day with fabric swatches for table linens, claiming it was a gift, Calvin felt the first real crack in his resolve. Theodore stood firm beside him, politely but clearly asking Edward to respect their space. As the door closed, Calvin turned to Theodore, tears in his eyes. "I thought I'd outgrown needing his approval. Why does it still hurt?" Theodore kissed his forehead, answering without words that their love was the only approval that mattered. The days pressed on with final rehearsals and emotional toasts from friends, each moment strengthening the bond between Calvin and Theodore while exposing the widening rift with the man who had once tried to erase it entirely. Rehearsal dinner arrived under string lights at the waterfront pavilion, laughter echoing as friends shared stories of how Calvin and Theodore had first met at a charity run for LGBTQ causes. Edward sat quietly at first, but as toasts began, he stood and spoke of pride in my son's courage, the words ringing hollow to Calvin, who remembered the slurs and silence of a decade ago. Theodore's hand found Calvin's under the table, a lifeline as Edward segued into anecdotes about the family business needing a modern image to attract younger clients. The subtle shift in tone made Calvin's skin prickle, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the warmth of the man beside him. Later, walking along the pier with Theodore, the water lapping softly, Calvin voiced the growing suspicion. "It's not just reconciliation. He's positioning our wedding like a business launch." Theodore nodded, his light hair tousled by the breeze, eyes reflecting the city glow. "Then we protect what matters. Us." They spent the night talking through scenarios, Calvin recalling therapy sessions where he had learned to separate his worth from his father's opinion, Theodore reminding him of the day they adopted their rescue dog, a symbol of the family they were creating on their own terms. The conversation stretched into dawn, solidifying their commitment to authenticity over obligation. The following week brought the final fitting and a surprise visit from Edward with legal documents, claiming he wanted to secure the future by adding Calvin to the company board as a wedding gift. The papers outlined shares and responsibilities that would require Calvin to move back east part-time, effectively inserting Edward into their married life. Calvin stared at the pages, the room spinning with the realization that the band from years ago had evolved into a new form of control. "You can't buy my future, Dad," he said quietly, voice steady despite the storm inside. Edward's face hardened briefly before smoothing into concern, but the mask slipped enough for Theodore to see the calculation. That night, alone, Calvin broke down in Theodore's arms, questioning every choice that had led to this moment, the internal crisis peaking as he grappled with whether forgiving meant sacrificing the independence he had fought so hard to claim. Friends rallied the next day at a brunch Marcus hosted, sharing their own stories of parental manipulation in the gay community, how society often expected queer individuals to perform reconciliation for optics. Emily pulled Calvin aside, revealing phone calls from their father about investor meetings tied to the big family event. The pieces clicked into place, the exploitation no longer subtle. Theodore listened to it all, then took Calvin for a drive along the coast, stopping at a viewpoint where they had picnicked years earlier. "Your growth isn't measured by his acceptance," he said, the waves crashing below like a chorus of affirmation. Calvin leaned into him, feeling the weight lift slightly as they reaffirmed their vows in private words spoken to the wind. The days leading to the wedding became a test of resilience, Calvin throwing himself into final details while navigating Edward's increasingly insistent calls about media coverage. One evening, during a quiet dinner at home, Calvin confronted the core fear. That loving Theodore openly had always come with a price, first rejection, now manipulation. Theodore held him through it, their conversation weaving through memories of hospital visits when Calvin had been ill, the quiet strength that defined their partnership. By the end, Calvin felt a shift, the internal voice of doubt quieting under the certainty of their bond. Edward's final attempt came via email, attaching a press release draft featuring the wedding as a testament to family evolution, and Calvin responded with a single line, "Our love isn't for sale." The response was silence, but the tension built like a gathering storm as the ceremony date loomed. The betrayal fully surfaced 2 days before the wedding during a private meeting Edward requested at his hotel. Calvin arrived alone at Theodore's insistence, expecting one last plea, but found documents spread across the table outlining how the wedding publicity had already secured a major investor deal for the company, with clauses requiring Calvin's ongoing involvement. "It's for the family legacy," Edward said, dropping the pretense. "Your happiness was the perfect cover." The words landed like a physical blow, echoing the original ban that had stripped Calvin of his voice years ago. He left without a word, driving straight to Theodore's office, where they sat in the car for hours processing the manipulation that had masqueraded as redemption. Theodore's steady presence kept Calvin from spiraling, reminding him of the community they had built, the friends who had become brothers, the life that didn't need Edward's stamp. That night, surrounded by their chosen family at an impromptu gathering, Calvin shared the truth, tears flowing as he described the years of hiding and the fresh wound of exploitation. Marcus raised a glass to love that refuses to be used, and the room filled with stories of similar struggles, reinforcing that Calvin's journey was shared by many gay men navigating family and society. Theodore held him afterward, their conversation turning to the core question of identity, who they were when stripped of external validation. Calvin felt the growth solidify, the boy banned from love becoming the man who chose it fiercely. The eve of the wedding brought a quiet crisis when Edward showed up at their apartment uninvited, demanding a public statement for the investors. The confrontation escalated in the hallway, voices rising as Calvin finally voiced every suppressed hurt. The nights of isolation, the therapy that rebuilt him, the love with Theodore that had healed what Edward had broken. Theodore stood shoulder to shoulder, calm but unyielding, declaring that no business deal would overshadow their commitment. Edward left defeated, but the emotional toll left Calvin questioning if he could walk down the aisle without the shadow. They spent the night talking through it, Theodore sharing his own past rejection and how choosing Calvin had been the bravest act of his life. By morning, the doubt had transformed into clarity, their bond stronger for having faced the storm together. The wedding day dawned bright over Seattle, the waterfront pavilion alive with flowers and friends who had become family. Calvin stood at the altar in his tailored suit, heart steady as Theodore approached, their eyes locking in a moment that erased every doubt. Vows were exchanged with raw honesty, promising a future built on truth and mutual respect, the ceremony a testament to the growth they had earned through pain and perseverance. Edward was absent by choice, his manipulation exposed but not allowed to steal the joy. As they kissed under the arch, applause rising from the crowd, Calvin felt the final piece of his identity click into place. no longer defined by the father's ban or schemes, but by the love he had fought to claim. Reception toasts celebrated resilience, Marcus joking about the plot twist dad, while Emily hugged them both, whispering pride in the men they had become. Dancing under the stars, Calvin and Theodore moved as one, the city skyline witnessing a victory not just of love but of self-acceptance. In the quiet hours after guests left, they sat on the pier, reflecting on the journey from rejection to this unbreakable union. Calvin, realizing the true awakening, was learning that family was chosen, not inherited. The years of internal conflict had forged a deeper strength, allowing him to face society without apology and embrace Theodore without reservation. As the moon reflected on the water, Calvin turned to Theodore with a smile that held the weight of every battle won. Their story wasn't over, but the chapter of exploitation had closed, leaving space for a future written on their terms. True or false? A father's change of heart can erase years of rejection if it benefits him?